So this is a bucket of ready to go sourdough starter, and we can take a look this morning. I wish that I could somehow convey smell, but smelling this is an important step every morning to get an idea of development. And so if you're using a sourdough starter, at the beginning, when I was first getting to know Harriet and building a relationship with the sourdough starter, I don't know if I was like afraid of the starter or what it is, but was reluctant to do things like smell or taste. But this is a really important part of your journey as a sourdough baker, and it's very important that at least you smell and visually confirm where your sourdough starter is for a given day. So this is 11 kilos of starter, and it's topping out nearly at 20 liters in the bowl, so it's about doubled. I see tons and tons of bubbles on the surface, and the way that we like to manage our starter is making sure that it's slowly cooling down as it's maturing. So the fermentation process on a sourdough starter is not a whole lot different than the fermentation process on your doughs, except it doesn't have any salt in it. It's just flour and water and microbes. When you feed a sourdough starter white flour, the typical time to maturity is 6 to 8 hours if you feed at a 1-to-2 ratio. So 1-to-2 ratio meaning 1 part mature starter that you have left over and 2 parts water, 2 parts flour. Typically at that rate, if you get to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, I think that's 26 Celsius. I'm not very good with those conversions with temperature, but I think it's around 26 Celsius. You can expect that it will take about 8 hours to mature. Now, along that curve, what we're trying to do is by the 8-hour mark to cool it down, and we're trying to get it into the 50s Fahrenheit by the time that it's at maturity. And that way we're trapping it in its fully matured state for a longer period of time. This is something that took us a while to start doing. It's another thing that anyone watching can benefit from our harder lessons, because when we were first starting, we didn't know anything, and we couldn't go into YouTube and find a bakery that was doing long format videos. And so we had to learn mostly by trial and error. And when you're in that mode, I mean, at least when I'm in that mode, I take some safer approaches. When I don't know something, I only take the amount of risk that I can sort of plausibly rationalize. And in the very beginning stages, I couldn't rationalize anything about my sourdough starter. You have to understand that if you roll the tapes back 4 years, I had never baked a loaf of bread. And that's kind of the interesting thing about our world, is when you have to do something in an almost medieval way, and if you have to sort of teach yourself from the ground up, well, I mean, 4 years pass, and it's just sort of insane how comfortable it feels. You know, we started this conversation today with the idea that making this particular bread is a very grounding experience. And it's because it's so wholesome and simple at the end of the day. Flour, water, and salt. This is just flour and water. The way that you make a sourdough starter is you just put flour and water together. We get all kinds of messages all the time asking us about our starter and whether we sell it. I've always been reluctant. I think we will start selling our starter for those that want it in our new stores in downtown Mesa. We've been talking about it a lot, so my guess is we will start selling it. We're also looking at ways of helping people start with a dehydrated starter. But the truth is, all it takes is taking flour and water, putting them together, and holding them at the right temperature for the appropriate amount of days, doing the appropriate amount of feedings to build a starter up. And it's incredible that just flour and water can turn into something that then feeds bread going forward. You can imagine that there wasn't probably a whole lot of written down thought on how to develop a sourdough starter 10,000 years ago when the Egyptians were making bread with a sourdough starter. In other words, they were taking pieces of their bread from the day before and using those leftover pieces of dough to leaven the dough the next day. And that's essentially what this is. The starter that we keep is considered a liquid one. So liquid starters are anything that looks a little bit more like batter and a little bit less like dough. So if you look at the consistency of it, it's very batter-like. Now, because it's been refrigerated, it has a little bit more of the properties of dough. At room temperature, it's even more liquid. The more liquid it gets, you want to start questioning whether you've let it mature a little bit too far. As a starter matures, all those bonds that happen between flour and water, really the gluten that's forming, which, by the way, I don't know if people realize that that's all that gluten really is just flour and water combining into a protein web. When I learned that, it was really clarifying for me, because leading up to it, I was also subject to everything that's out there about anti-gluten this, anti-gluten that. And truly, people do have gluten sensitivities, although if you work with gluten on a daily basis like I do, you understand that gluten has a curvature to its development too. At first, when you first bind it together, it's not all that strong yet. If you rip it, it just rips right out. This same dough in an hour, if I do this with it, it won't rip like this because the web that's forming is getting stronger. Now, that has a finite amount. So the web is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger as we're in the bins, as we're preparing to do the final shaping. And then, from then on, once it sort of reaches peak strength, it starts to break down. And the same thing happens naturally without any kind of agitation, just time. So going back to the sourdough starter, right now it's really strong for a sourdough starter. This is 100% hydration. So there's the same amount of water as there is flour. And so the fact that I can sort of pull it without it ripping when it's, I mean, if you don't believe me, simply mix a batch of anything that's just 1 part flour, 1 part water, and watch that it's pretty much liquid. The reason that this has any strength right now is the web of gluten that's formed being at sort of peak strength at the moment. We don't bake bread at peak strength though. By the time the bread hits the oven, the gluten is actually already weakening, because now it's 24 hours old. If you were to watch your starter at 24 hours, you'd notice what happens. Basically right now, I've got a doubling effect. There's only 10 point something liters of starter in this bucket, and yet volumetrically it's closer to 20. As the starter matures, it's going to recede down and lose its strength and become more and more liquid, more and more having the smell of alcohol. Whereas right now it just has a sharp kind of acidic smell to it. When it's not mature, it has more of a smell of bananas. So smell is a really important distinguishing factor on where your sourdough starter is at any given moment. Going back to the gluten development, we try to mix and develop our doughs, building strength, and we try to have our bread ready to go, resting in a banneton at peak strength and then sort of slowly weakening. So by the time our customers enjoy the bread, the gluten has already kind of been broken down, which is one of the reasons why sourdough, being a long fermentation process, is easier for people to digest. A lot of folks that have gluten intolerances, a lot of people that claim to have celiac, which is actually a true gluten allergy, say that they can have sourdough. My guess on it is that we all have some sort of level of intolerance to gluten in its toughest form. In other words, When gluten is fully developed, if you try to digest it at that time, it's hard for our bodies to digest it. When you look at the way that bread is manufactured, and I use the term manufacture because most bread that's consumed doesn't have this level of human input. As you scale up bread production, I mean, consider that this bakery, despite to probably many of you being larger scale, is a baby bakery in comparison to the bakeries that are actually selling most of the bread that we consume, which are full warehouses filled with assembly lines of equipment, no different than an assembly line that, you know, makes a car. It's that automated. And so when bread is made in that environment, it's out of the oven within 2 hours. And the gluten really is just still on its upward trajectory. So we are then solidifying the bread in a very strong form. Whereas sourdough is very different in that regard. So I know exactly how much starter I have in this bucket because of what my label says the refresh was. So I know that it's the exact amount that I need for this mix, and we intentionally do that. So this is our most common mix, and so we intentionally mix our sourdough starters to where a 5-gallon bucket of starter is the exact amount that I need for this mix. It's 11 kilos of dough. So I am putting this in because the 20 minutes that I needed for my auto lease are basically up. So I just put it in right on top. I use the dough scraper to make sure that the inside is pretty clean. You can really get a lot of detail. Dough scrapers are really like our version of a kitchen spatula. We have those too, but I find these to be a little bit more functional for the bakery. And my last thing is salt. Jeff, can you measure me out 1,272 grams of salt? Yep.